Tēnā koutou te whānau o Auckland Unitarian, tēnā koutou ngā manuhiri, nau mai, haere mai, ki tēnei whare karakia o te atua, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou, katoa. My name is Ruby and I will be leading the service today. We welcome you into this space made sacred by Auckland Unitarians for over 120 years. This includes those of you who are joining us online or who may be watching this at a later date. For those of you in the building with us, please join us after the service for morning tea. It is our sacrament of hospitality. Today's opening words are by Elizabeth Mount. From our very first breath, we reach out. Co-regulation, not self-regulation, is in our nature. We find our cues from the sun and moon, from each parent and caregiver. We find our place in this great turning planet by turning to one another, generation to generation. We awaken to the dawn and fall asleep at the evening's end. Our life's journey is a part of something greater, something simple, something divine. A flame cannot be lit without a spark, a life cannot begin without the air, and we cannot begin to find ourselves without love. May we reach out to one another, may we offer love and nurturing care, may we join together in celebration of the interdependence of our lives. In this spirit, let us worship together. Who's going to light the flame for me today? Rachel. Today's chalice lighting is by Ben Soul. Let us hold a quiet moment now as we light our chalice. Henry David Thoreau wrote in his journal on February 2nd, 1941, "A child asked his father what became of the old moon, and he said it was cut up into stars. Consider the light, light out of darkness. Light begets light. The light which the God of Genesis brought out of the darkness is the light that became our world. Our sun's light reflecting off our moon is eclipsed, but then returns to us as our earth quietly moves out of its way. In our current scientific understanding of the origins of the universe, the light of everything that exploded from not quite nothing is the light that became the maybe everything of which we are barely a part. This light we now kindle here will become a light for each of us to carry forth as we find our way through the shadows on our path. Let us be grateful for the light in our lives, even as we honor the dark from which the light came." Now, will those who are willing please join me in reciting the covenant of our congregation? Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is the sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony. Thus do we covenant with each other and with our God. Today's reading is by Michael Werner. For all the talk about reason and science, humanism is really about a passionate love affair. It is a love affair with life, not a mystical hereafter. Humanism is a love affair with a progressive vision of civilization in which each of us can add to our growing library of wisdom, our evolving knowledge of what there is and what is truly important. None of the great achievements in history would have been possible without a love of the adventure of learning and the adventure of creating a better life. Our great cultural achievements in science, art, music, literature, philosophy, history, psychology, and political thought all inform each other and have been born of that long humanist tradition. Humanism is a devotion to humanity and the biosphere that humanity is a part of. It is our passionate commitment to the best ideals that are supported by what experience, science, and civilization have taught us. Humanism is larger than any of us. We have a duty to continue humanism's evolving tradition, which has inspired countless individuals to make the world better. At the same time, it motivates us to fill our lives with transcendent purpose for a meaningful, exuberant existence that makes life worth living. Well, our main talk today is The American Transcendentalists by Peter Lineham.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you again today to talk about the Transcendentalist movement. I want to start by giving you a little flavour of the Transcendentalists by reading a passage which I think is really rather special by Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is the very end, final paragraph of his book that caused such a stir in New England in 1836, Nature. So shall we come to look at the world with new eyes. It shall answer the endless inquiry of the intellect. What is truth? And of the affections, what is good? By yielding itself passive to the educated will. Then shall come to pass what my poet said, nature is not fixed but fluid. Spirit alters, moulds, makes it. The immobility or bruteness of nature is the absence of spirit. To pure spirit it is fluid, it is volatile, it is obedient. Every spirit builds itself a house, and beyond its house a world, and beyond its world a heaven. Know then that the world exists for you. For you is the phenomenon perfect. What are we that only can we see? All that Adam had, all that Caesar could, you have, and you do. Adam called his house heaven and earth. Caesar called his house Rome. You perhaps call yours a cobbler's trade, 100 acres of ploughed land, or a scholar's garret. Yet line for line and point for point, your dominion is as great as theirs, though without fine names. Build, therefore, your own world. As fast as you conform your life to the pure idea in your mind, that will unfold its great proportions. A correspondent revolution in things will attend the influx of the Spirit. So fast will disagreeable appearances, swine, spiders, snakes, pests, madhouses, prisons, enemies vanish. They are temporary, and they shall dry up, and the wind exhale. As when the summer comes from the south, the snowbanks melt, and the face of the earth becomes green before it. So shall the advancing Spirit create its ornaments along its path, and carry with it the beauty it visits, and the song which enchants it. It shall draw beautiful faces, warm hearts, wise discourse, and heroic acts around its way until evil is no more seen. The kingdom of man over nature, which cometh not with observation, a dominion such as now is beyond his dream of God, he shall enter without more wonder than the blind man feels, who is gradually restored to perfect sight. Now, I must say I didn't read that very well because I hadn't figured that in the old edition, which I happen to have, it's quite difficult to read out aloud and not lose one's line. So apologies if that didn't make any sense. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the writer of those lines, wrote them to upset Unitarians. He knew how to upset them because he was a Unitarian. Emerson was from a great Unitarian family, trained at Harvard College. His brother William, educated at Gottingen, was a minister of the Unitarian Church, and Waldo followed his brother to become minister of the Second Church at Boston in 1829. Then his wife died. he was traumatized. And the church gave him a break of 6 months, and he headed to Europe. And as he kind of dealt with his grief and unpacked what was going on in his mind, he felt that he needed to express something that he felt was lacking in the Unitarianism of his day. He came back. He did not stay at the church. He resigned his position, became a lecturer. But he still was available for supply preaching when there was a vacancy in a pulpit. And then in 1838, he was invited to speak to the Divinity Class at Harvard. And his words, and Harvard had been taken over by the Unitarians effectively. It had become a Unitarian school. And his words to the graduating class caused an extraordinary controversy. He said, "Historical Christianity has fallen into the error that corrupts all attempts to communicate religion. As it appears to us, and as it has appeared for ages, it is not a doctrine of the soul, but an exaggeration of the personal, the positive, the ritual. It dwells with noxious exaggeration about the person of Jesus. The soul knows no persons. It invites every man to expand to the full circle of the universe and will have no preferences but those of spontaneous love. But by this Eastern monarchy of a Christianity which indolence and fear have built, the friend of man is made the injurer of man. The manner in which his name is surrounded with expressions which were once the sallies of admiration and love, but are now petrified into official titles, kills all generous sympathy and liking. All who hear me feel that the language that describes Christ to Europe and America is not the style of friendship and enthusiasm to a good and noble heart, but it's appropriated and formal, paints a demigod, as the Orientals or the Greeks would describe Osiris or Apollo." Well, that was a bit of a shock for Unitarians to hear. You might be surprised. And here is the interesting challenge of Unitarians. The first Unitarians, at least was the first American Unitarians, had moved from being Congregationalists to rejecting the notion that Jesus was divine. And so there had been a split in 1825 with the New English Congregational Union. They had 15 member churches at that stage. The greatest of their ministers was William Ellery Channing, the minister of Federal Street Church, whose book of sermons I have somewhere at my house, but I've turned it upside down and can't find it as of yet, but it will show up at some stage. And they believed that in rejecting the divinity of Christ, they had returned Christianity to a truly rational form of Christianity. So they kept all the appearances of a standard church service going with prayers and communion and baptism, etc., except that they rejected the divinity of Christ. They had Bible readings, etc., etc. And now one of their own accuses them of being just a tradition, in love with titles, in love with rituals, not truly open to the Spirit. Emerson really could be outrageous. I have sometimes thought that in order to be a good minister, he wrote, it was necessary to leave the ministry. The profession is antiquated. In an altered age, we worship the dead forms of our forebears. What exactly is going on here? I think in Emerson, we see the figure who did more to create the modern Unitarian movement than the people who effectively ran the organization at the time. Over the next few years, there grew up around Emerson this group known as the Transcendentalists. Emerson was a key member, but there were others of great note in the movement. Hedge, Putnam, and Margaret Fuller, who formed the little Transcendental Club. And then the later movements included Thoreau, whose reading we heard just a moment ago, and various ministers, including one who's of great interest to me, Theodore Parker, who was remained a Unitarian minister but was an ardent transcendentalist. And I've spent the week reading. Again, I collect old books, and this is an edition of the life of Parker. It's a most interesting story. What exactly is transcendentalism? It's difficult to define, but in essence, it was a call to people who was deeply committed to being rational, that rationality was not enough. That in order to find higher spiritual truths, you would need to listen to your heart and not just to your brain. Thus, transcendentalism was about how we live our lives. You can see they're very influenced by the Romantic movement. They were touched by that movement that had engulfed Europe, but not particularly America at this stage. They caught up rather late. There's this great moment when Emerson, on that trip to Europe, decides he will track down the two Romantic writers who've most inspired him, and that's Wordsworth and Coleridge. Because to him, Wordsworth and Coleridge so epitomized that blend of sharp thinking, but also search for the inner spirit. Unfortunately, by the time he got to Europe, these were crabby old men. His visit to Coleridge, he simply got a lecture on the errors of Unitarianism compared to Trinitarianism, which had been adopted by Coleridge rather late in his life. And then he headed up to the Lake Country, tracked down Wordsworth, who was very happy to wander with him around the Lake Country, but in effect was gaga, had very little to say of much significance. He got much more enjoyment out of meeting Thomas Carlyle. So transcendentalism picked up on some of these romantic themes, but wanted to develop them in different ways. And I think it's fair to say this, that it moved Unitarianism beyond its Protestant roots into something different. Emerson and his friends were very prepared to explore Indian ideas, Platonic idealism, utopianism, you name it. But at the heart of it lay this belief that the inner life was where we meet the deepest truths. That you cannot teach spirituality in a classroom, or maybe even in a church. They have to be known intuitively. Somehow you need to awaken faith in your spirit. So they weren't frightened of mystical experiences. They talked points on natural supernaturalism, if that makes any sense. They saw God everywhere. They hated the materialism of the scientific method. They believed instead, as that reading I was trying to get to you conveys, the sense that nature is the place of spirit. For that rediscovery of nature, well, if you know anything of Thoreau, who in Walden Pond, is describing this place where in solitude he can find spirit. He can find in meditation upon nature the presence that he doesn't find with other people. Emerson once said he was more a Quaker than anything else. He hated organization. Now, one might say that in individuality, an overemphasis on individuality, is a particular kind of American way of approaching life. I don't know. I think there's something in that maybe. Emerson looked at the wonder of himself, and he looked at the world with new eyes from within himself. In his famous essay in 1841 on self-reliance, he wrote, "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." And he demanded the right to change his mind, to have sudden inspiration. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. He celebrated Walt Whitman above all. Whitman, the song of myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself. I was talking yesterday to former mayor of Waitakere City, Bob Harvey, and he had tracked down Whitman's grave in some dreadful dump of a city and sat in front of the grave for he said, most of the day, just meditating, as Whitman would have highly improved of just waiting for some kind of spiritual connection. Or take Thoreau. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear, nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put rout to all that was not life, to cut a broad swathe and to shave closely, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms, and if it proved to be mean, why then, to get the whole and genuine meaningness of it and to publish its meanness to the world, or if it were sublime, to know it by experience and to be able to give true account of it in my next excursion. For most men, it appears to me, are in a strange uncertainty about it, whether it is, thank you so much, of the devil or of God, and have somewhat hastily concluded that it is the chief end of man here to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Well, that's Thoreau. Of course, you might accuse this approach to life, well, surely it would have no positive impact on the world, but that's very far from the case, because an interesting thing about the Transcendentalists is that they became very involved in the anti-slavery movement. Remember that we're talking of that period when America is heading to the great crisis, which will in the end produce the Civil War and the Confederacy and potentially break apart the Union. And in 1847, 48, was it, the bill was passed that ordered the North to return any slaves that escaped back to the South. And this caused horror among Transcendentalists. Theodore Parker abominated slavery. He opposed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and he started to get his church, his little Unitarian church, to be involved in hiding slaves away from those who were going to try and return them. He campaigned for peace when the USA declared war on Mexico in order to grab California. He advocated temperance, education, and the rights of women. It's interesting because there's quite an influence here indirectly on Lincoln, I think, and Lincoln's ideas of seeing the potential of peace. So they're a movement that are renowned for a deep sense of purpose, which means that they will be civil disobedience, will be a feature of their approach to life. Thoreau wrote, "Disobedience is the true foundation of liberty. The obedient must be slaves." That was an interesting take on it. Of course, there were kind of crazy ends, as you'd expect, the Transcendentalists. The most famous was Brook Farm in West Roxbury, the utopian community that set out to create the perfect world. And it meddles a lot in those utopian movements that were common in the mid-19th century in the States. But it is interesting that the Transcendentalist search for God and nature faded a bit by the 1850s and was replaced by social reform became the central theme of those people who had once been Transcendentalists. Why am I telling you about this? Well, I think there's quite a lot to learn, and I want to pick on it from two sides. Firstly, pondering the strengths and weaknesses of a movement that's done quite a lot to shape Unitarianism, I think. I think probably the big problem, you might say, was that Transcendentalists had little use for a religious community. Their sense of where they found God didn't involve getting together with other people. Emerson, when he first spoke that famous sermon given to the Divinity students, whenever the pulpit is usurped by a formalist, then is the worshipper defrauded and disconsolate. We shrink as soon as the prayers begin, which do not uplift but smite and offend us. We are fain to wrap our cloaks around us and secure as best we can a solitude that hears not. I once heard a preacher who sore tempted me to say, I would go to church no more. Men go, I thought, where they are wont to go, else had no soul entered the temple this afternoon. And so what he feels is that Unitarianism had tried to keep the shell, the structure, the formality going, but it had lost the inner spirit. And of course the difficulty is that you take the individuality too far. And you can see in some of the Transcendentalists, in fact, without any connection to other people, drifting completely free. There's almost a vanity in some of the real individualists, that they only exist for themselves. And that, I guess, is the risk. So there are plenty of critiques of Transcendentalism. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Melville. Remember in Moby Dick that the story is of the darker side of humanity, which they felt that the Transcendentalists had never understood, that if you contemplate nature, sometimes what you get is not a pretty sight. Now, it's interesting because most people think of Transcendentalism as a literary movement, because their writers were of such extraordinary literary skill. They created a form of literature that is very significant in the history of American literature. But I'm arguing that it was a religious movement that wanted to make of Unitarianism something that would be of value to people who'd moved on beyond Christianity. So they almost all had a Unitarian background, but they saw that something was damaging their church, and it was that they were endlessly expounding Jesus in the likes of John Locke, if you see what I mean. That everything was so rational. Everything was so carefully argued. These long, earnest disquisitions that were characteristic of Unitarianism in those days, which were kind of like lectures. I might be accused of that, of course. But the Unitarians, the problem was that they were still very, very committed to the Enlightenment. They all solemnly, this surprised me, in this first generation of Unitarians believed in the resurrection, believed in Jesus' miracles, and the Transcendentalists stepped apart from that, much more influenced by German ideas, German scholarship. Transcendentalists were very happy with a natural religion. Unitarians were still theists. And the Transcendentalists were not. They didn't necessarily then reject Unitarianism. They wanted to refine it. Parker is such an interesting example of this. Parker became because remember that a lot of people who became Unitarians were originally Congregationalists and then had stepped outside. So Parker was in this little church in West Roxbury, which I gather is just out of Boston. And he had just 100 people who attended his sermons, but they caused a great impression. But no Unitarian would offer him a pulpit. No church wanted him because they weren't quite sure whether he would upset them too much. And so, interestingly, he started his own, the 28th Congregational Church, and it is still up back, I gather, in Boston, the Theodore Parker Church. And in the end, the crowds grew so large that he had to hire the music hall to preach in. But the service that he ran was very different because he didn't offer the normal sort of prayers. Like Emerson, he refused to provide communion or baptism or anything like that because he felt it had to be something different. And so he wasn't just governed, as the Unitarians were, by trying to find a rational New Testament Christianity. And for saying that, they were very unpopular. But they were, in a sense, I think, the future of Unitarianism. Unitarianism, I think, has been profoundly reshaped by Transcendentalism. But what is the spiritual benefit that today all of us, in whatever we hold or believe, may learn from the Transcendentalists? Well, I think, firstly, we need to acknowledge this tension between the role of the inner person and the need for community. I think that Transcendentalists were right to tell us to learn to be still and quiet and listen and feel the deepest truths that lie at the heart of this universe. But I think there is the other side to the story, and it's the side of the Unitarians like Parker who said, actually, we also need the community. We also need one another. It isn't easy if everybody's going to have their own conceptions or their own values, but community is vitally important. Barry Andrews, a UU minister, whose sermons on Transcendentalism I read in preparation for this, urged Unitarians to reclaim the Transcendentalist heritage as their own. He noted that there's a huge longing for spirituality in our very empty society. But many people these days assume that there are no answers in the West, that you have to go to the East or some exotic form of spirituality to find it. But remember that the Transcendentalists offered not just spirituality, but also a concern for society. They were facing the society as well as thinking of their spirits. And so maybe you don't need to know everything about Emerson to discover these truths, but you do need to remember the lesson from Transcendentalism, that it is critical that your religion be not all knowledge of what you think is right and wrong, but also concerned with the longings and the spiritual desires of your heart.
Thank you, Peter. That was really wonderful. It resonated in a lot of ways. This internal sitting quietly sort of comes out a lot now in mindfulness, I think, and that draws a lot on Eastern practices as well. It gave me a lot to think about. Thank you. Well, we'll have Frank's piano piece now then, our delayed piano piece. Frank. Will those who are willing please join me in reciting the words for Extinguishing the Chalice? Extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth. The warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Today's closing words are by Kendall L.R. Gibbons. There is, finally, only one thing required of us. That is to take life whole, the sunlight and shadows together. To live the life that is given to us with courage and humour and the truth. We have such a little moment out of the vastness of time for all our wondering and loving. Therefore, let there be no half-heartedness. Rather, let the soul be ardent in its pain, in its yearning, in its praise. Then shall peace enfold our days, and glory shall not fade from our lives. Now for the postlude, I think we have Jamie. Yes? Okay, he's playing Elaine litanies rather. And another round of applause for Frank as well. Well, I think all that remains is the discussion question for the week, which is, what do we need to learn from the Transcendentalists today? So I hope you were paying attention during Peter's talk, or you'll look very foolish.